Janine, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to speak with you.
All right, so tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So I say that I am a family formation attorney and a reproductive rights advocate. Most of my private clients are surrogates, egg donors, sperm donors, embryo donors, and intended parents. I also do adoption work, and through meeting my private clients over the years, they inspired me to get involved in legislative advocacy. So I spend a lot of time doing legislative work and advocating for different bills at state and federal levels. So that has been the focus of this past year for me, and I hope that that continues.
How did you get into this area of law?
I've had a long and varied past. So when I first finished law school, I joined a matrimonial firm on Long Island in New York, where I'm from. Before moving to Memphis, Tennessee, and doing criminal defense, I had an incredible mentor, and that was really cool. I always had an interest in representing people in the fringes of society and the disenfranchised. And then I moved again to Portland, Maine, took a few years away from law, found this, and knew that that was what was next for me, and I've never looked back.
I know when I was in law school, I took a class on reproductive law or something of the kind. I think it was just general family law, but we talked a lot about this topic. And the professor was basically like, here are the issues. What do you think should happen? And students would stand up and they'd give their answer. And he would basically say, well, there is no answer. So congrats, you're all right. Because it was really the wild west of law. And in many ways it still is, but I think across the country, we're seeing more case law, we're seeing more statutes. And so given that regulation, how have you seen change over time in this area?
This area of law is ever changing. I'm thrilled that you even had this as a topic in law school, because when I was in law school, this was not on anyone's radar. So I don't think that we will see any stagnation coming. I think it will continue to evolve. Yeah. Luckily, thankfully, science outpaces the law, as it should, right? But I don't see there being any slowing to this momentum of changing legal landscape anytime soon.
And oftentimes when we talk about reproductive technology law, we're talking about it in the context of family law. But I'd like to remind people, family law is a super broad scope, right? You have divorce, you have adoption, you have reproductive technologies. Can you tell me a little bit about the difference in your practice?
Sure. So assisted reproductive law is vastly different than adoption law. Adoption law has been around for a long time. Every state has some sort of framework for adoption. Reproductive law is very different. Some states have a lack of legislation. Some states have explicit legislation, and other states have explicit bans. Mm-hmm. So it's very, very different than adoption law historically. And going forward, I don't see that changing either. This is why we get so prickly as reproductive attorneys about referring to embryo donation as embryo adoption. It is not embryo adoption.
I guess it depends what state you're in.
Yes. Or what agency you work for. There are a number of faith-based agencies that only use the term embryo adoption. But I think most, if not all, reproductive lawyers will tell you that that is a misnomer.
Yep. What should couples be thinking about when they're planning to put an embryo clause in their prenup?
I think prenups are the perfect place to put embryo clauses. When you look at the New York statute for embryo disposition, the requirements kind of track a prenup requirements, right? And you're planning what happens to your property upon your divorce and sometimes upon your death, right? Which is what you do in prenups. So at the start of your marriage or at the start of your relationship that you are committing to each other, why would you not talk about these things, right? You're talking about property. You should talk about family building. And embryos are certainly property within the context of your family building. So I think it's a perfect time that you should be having these conversations.
So if I'm a fiance and I'm recently engaged, I'm prepping my prenup, I'm working with you through HelloPrenup, and I'm like, why am I talking about reproductive technology so early? It feels premature to me. I've never experienced this. What would your response be to me?
Sure. Let's look at the pros and cons. there are no cons to talk about it this early. Yeah. The best case scenario, you put it in your prenup and you never need it. That's great.
Yeah.
Wonderful. The worst case scenario, there's a phenomenal article out there. It's in The Cut. Forgive me, I forgot the journalist's name. But
I know exactly which one you're talking about,
yes.
where the woman, she details out how much it costs.
Many women will talk to you about the negatives of not having these discussions. So when you're talking about like, okay, maybe it's uncomfortable and it's an uncomfortable conversation. Maybe you've overplanned. Maybe you take the romance out of it for a few days, right? Yeah. But the consequences of not putting it in can be catastrophic. So why would you not include it?
And let's talk about cost. So it's an expensive process. And
yes.
Any reproductive technology is not widely available to everybody at every income level. So how should we be thinking about cost in the context of a prenup?
I have been pushing for access to fertility care through mandates, but even with the best case scenario, so in Maine and New York, we do have fertility mandates so people can afford assisted reproduction. It's still expensive. You're still going to have to hire another set of attorneys, right? If you're already hiring attorneys for your prenup, as long as they're well-versed in assisted reproductive law, why not add these clauses into your prenup? If not, and you do find out years down the road that you do need IVF, right? You're going to be at this crossroads again.
How should couples be thinking about the cost? Because again, like we're talking about a prenup where we're talking about all of our finances. We're having open and honest, transparent discussions about what the future might look like for us as a couple financially in terms of our life goals and plans. Is a prenup the right place to talk about who's paying for what?
Why not? I think that's a great time to have these conversations because as part of your prenup, if you are talking about the distribution of property upon the termination of your marriage, right? It may come up in the context of maintenance or alimony, right? Well, I want to be at home with our children. Your partner says, what children? And you then share that you want to have 2 or 3 or 4 children, right? And maybe you have knowledge that you might need IVF or you might need some form of assisted reproduction. There's no better time to talk about it than when you're starting your family.
I totally agree. I think it's something that when we were considering adding this as a component into HelloPrenup, we talked a lot about what that might look like. And we worked with attorneys all over the country to ensure that we are doing it responsibly. So these clauses are included in ways that not only follow state law and requirements for validity, but also offer customers of HelloPrenup access to attorneys who are experts in that area. So they can kind of combine services. So, getting their prenup and having an attorney who's an expert in embryo law and art to help them better understand the implications of including something like this. A lot of states don't have law on this yet. What does that look like?
When it comes to assisted reproduction, like you said earlier, every state is so different, right?
Yeah.
The ways you can establish legal parentage through assisted reproduction, the avenues you have available to you depend on where you reside. And there's no difference when it comes to embryos, right? The legal status of an embryo is going to differ when you take that embryo across state lines, right? We saw what happened in Alabama this year.
Yep.
We know in Louisiana an embryo is a juridical person. Remember, Sofia Vergara's embryos sued her. And then Arizona has some weird statutes about embryos. And I think we're gonna see even more. I mean, Iowa had a very concerning personhood bill this legislative session that luckily died, but is it coming back? Probably. Florida, concerning legislation. So I think we're going to see more and more of this changing legal landscape, right? And you are going to, if you're a couple getting married in Texas and you know you might need fertility treatment, you are going to have these conversations, right? Do you want your embryos there?
So tell me a little bit more about the personhood for those who don't know what that means in a legal context.
So let's back it up a little bit to Dobbs. So what Dobbs did, I'm sure as every listener knows, return the issue of legislating abortion to the states, right? We keep hearing that language everywhere we turn, right? We didn't take away the right to abortion. We returned it to the states. So the personhood movement has been around for a long, long time, right? Some some states will say, but some people and some politicians are of the mindset that we're going to walk abortion bans all the way back to conception, right? To the point that sperm meets egg. It's called personhood, giving embryos the status of a legal person. Now, you don't have to have language about abortion bans if embryos are legal people, right? You don't have to explain that you can't destroy them because they're people. There's concerning consequences of doing so. So when we hear people talking about personhood, it's concerning for everyone in assisted reproduction law, right? Because what's going to happen is, like we saw in Alabama, where IVF is not able to coexist in a state that also has personhood legislation. The two are not possible.
Why is that?
Because you cannot have IVF and all of its advances in reproductive medicine if you also have personhood. Because if you have personhood, you're not allowing physicians to practice medicine the way they're supposed to be practicing medicine. They cannot provide their patients with the standard of care that is required of reproductive endocrinologists and even OBGYNs. So I don't want to spend the whole podcast going into like what's going on in all of these states that are leaning towards personhood or have very strict abortion bans, but you cannot have personhood and IVF. The two cannot coexist.
As a former family law attorney yourself, what do you think that family law attorneys should be thinking about when considering adding these clauses to a prenup?
Family law attorneys have to think about, there's two separate questions here. Ownership and dispositional control of an embryo, and then also who is the legal parent of a resulting child from that embryo. So those are two different questions. Yes, they're related, but the answers are not always the same. You need to define both in the prenuptial agreement. You need to address both. And it's also your opportunity to address what happens to embryos upon the death of a party, right? We can talk about posthumous parentage, and does someone want to be a legal parent of a child born to their spouse posthumously?
Can you give an example of that?
Sure.
Have you seen any examples of that?
Yes, it just happened. So, for example, husband and wife created embryos together. Husband passed away very unexpectedly. Clinic said, wait a minute, we want to allow you to move forward with an embryo transfer, but we just need to make sure we can. Okay. They did. She did move forward and had children, but then she wanted her husband's name on the birth certificate, and she wanted him to be acknowledged as a legal parent. So
that's tough.
Yes.
It's very emotional.
It is. And some states have a statute allowing for it. New York does. Maine does.
Yeah.
But the only requirement sometimes is that it's in writing. So is a clinic form enough? Or it certainly would be enough if it was in your prenup. You're also addressing what happens to property upon your death. Like, why not? This is, a few short sentences to prevent catastrophic consequences.
Do clinic forms have something in them that addresses this issue?
Yes, clinic forms have come a long way. Most clinic forms have come a long way. That being said, some courts see clinic forms as an agreement between the couple and the clinic and not necessarily an agreement between the parties. So it's always good to have an embryo disposition agreement, a prenup, something else just between you and your partner that addresses what happens to the embryos.
That's a really clear reason for attorneys who may be suspicious of the idea of adding an embryo clause into the prenup. That's a great reason to do that.
Absolutely, because you're going to save people heartache. Ultimately, it's heartache, right? Yes, money, sure, but heartache.
So I'm sure you know of the Arizona case, which is maybe my least favorite case of all time. Ruby Torres versus Terrell, her husband. They were getting a divorce. They had frozen embryos, and they had done so prior to getting married because Ruby was receiving cancer treatment. And the appeals court ruled that the embryos should be donated. Again, obviously, against Ruby's wishes, she wanted to have children. And the appeals court reasoned that Terrell's right not to be compelled to be a parent outweighs Torres's right to procreate and desire to have a biologically related child. This case is wild to me because it's so clear that they are choosing his rights over hers, even though he could still have biological children and she could not. What do you think about that case?
Absolutely. So, to my knowledge, there have been no cases where someone is compelled to be a parent. The court orders them to be a parent against their will, right? There's one case in Pennsylvania where they did award the embryos to the wife, but they did not compel the ex to be over the ex's objection for the wife to have them. They did not compel him to be a parent, right? I love
Which I think makes sense.
Sure.
Because you could give the wife in this instance, who is oftentimes the party who will be more injured, right? Without the embryos.
Right, but I love that this is the position taken, right, where I have yet to see where the woman is not left suffering, right? Let's compare this with personhood cases, and let's compare this with abortion bans, right? Talk about being compelled to become a parent.
Oh my God, you're right.
So
I never thought of it this way.
But politicians are saying the complete opposite, right? Like, you're absolutely compelled to be a parent when you're a woman that's pregnant in a red state. But you are not compelled to be a parent if you are a man objecting to your wife using your embryos in the context of a divorce. And if there's any other way to see that, I would love for someone to make that clear. But I can't see it any other way.
That is insane.
But it's true. There is no court case that I'm aware of where a judge tells an ex-husband, you are going to be a parent of these children because we're balancing your right not to procreate against your ex-wife's right to procreate, right?
Right.
We never see that when we're talking about abortion. This is what's so dangerous about the entire personhood movement, right? You can watch the documentary Zorowski versus Texas. The Center for Reproductive Rights is doing amazing things. It is so concerning to me as a woman, a parent of 2 daughters, that this is the trend that we're going in, right? Even if you, under the right circumstances, go through IVF, right, and you have embryos, and you still may not get to use those embryos, right, depending on where you live, or you might be compelled to use those embryos depending on where you live. And it's crazy to think in 2024 that we have to talk about restrictions to reproductive rights.
And if we're talking about Alabama, there may be potential criminal liability for destroying those embryos.
Absolutely, right? What about where they have to be implanted, right? Is that not compelling someone to become a parent against their will?
So for those who are not familiar with the Alabama case, could you walk us through it?
Sure. So this is a gross oversimplification. Someone got access to the lab that should not have had access to the lab, destroyed some embryos, pulled it out. It's cold. They can't hold it. But in
this case, supposedly they did.
Right.
That's what's being alleged, is that they
100%
took the straw out and they put their hand in this really cryogenic freezing.
Cryogenic nursery.
Right.
Yeah. Which is what the court called it.
Pulled it out.
Yes.
And they haven't burnt their hand off.
Right. Everything was totally fine. Yeah. And then dropped them, destroyed them in some capacity, right? And these families were arguing, yes, all of the usual claims that you expect to see, right? But they were also arguing wrongful death because you can recover more damages if you argue wrongful death. And I believe the trial court initially said no wrongful death claim here, and they appealed. But ultimately what happened was, in the Alabama Supreme Court, the opinion that was issued is appalling. I mean, it's filled with religious language, and they absolutely allow them to recover for wrongful death. It gave embryos, without legislating, the court gave embryos in Alabama the status of people, entitled to constitutional protections, at least in the state of Alabama. So what happened in the quick aftermath, right? All the IVF clinics in Alabama shut down. How can you practice? Like we said earlier, you cannot have IVF and personhood. The two cannot coexist together. So, and a number of people helped out on the legislation to fix that, right? But it's not great legislation because it's backdoor personhood onto the books. Now it's saying we can't undo what the court did, but we're going to protect doctors to allow them to practice medicine. If they destroy embryos, they're not going to be liable. But it is kind of ceding the point in Alabama that we can't undo this court rule, and it is what it is, and embryos have the status of children. And
wild.
It is crazy. I understand why the law was necessary. It just is not great.
And when you ask yourself who is the plaintiff in a wrongful death action of embryos, it's the parents. So I think the far-reaching legal implication is that if the parents were to choose to destroy their embryos, are they criminally liable for
Right.
murder?
Right. And can they transport them out of Alabama to destroy them? Is it kidnapping if they cross state lines and one parent objects, right? What's going to happen? And what happens if everywhere around Alabama follows suit? Do those couples not have access to IVF? Right? People with means, okay. What about the everyday normal American? Are they able to access IVF?
I think the sad thing right now is how expensive IVF is.
Yes, that's why fertility mandates are so important. Cost is one factor when we talk about access to IVF, but it's a big one, right? So the average IVF cycle costs quite a bit of money, and when you compare that to what the average American makes, especially in rural communities, not everyone can afford IVF.
Yeah.
And even if they can, clinics are not always accessible. They're not always nearby.
Yeah.
So it's definitely a challenge. I do think when we talk about prenups and putting embryo clauses in prenups, we are seeing definitely a trend in like larger cities, right? People are waiting longer to get married.
Yep.
They are accumulating more property before marriage. Yep. And sometimes women are freezing their eggs, right? And that's the first time how it came up for me. I represented someone in a prenup who had frozen her eggs, and she said, what happens if I make them into embryos?
You have a client who is getting married and has frozen her eggs, and she wants to protect those as her separate property in a prenup. What does that look like? How do you do that?
I would include them in her disclosure of separate property, though I'm not sure I would give them a monetary value. I might include the cost of any egg retrieval, right? But I don't know that I would give them a monetary value.
And then what if those eggs in the future are fertilized, and then what do the embryos become?
Right. So that's when you have to address that in the prenup, because regardless of even if we're talking about a cis woman in a hetero relationship, regardless of whether she's using her partner's sperm, if they're using her frozen eggs to create embryos, those embryos belong to the both of them. So you have to address it in a prenup. So, or you have to address it in an embryo disposition agreement. But if you're already doing a prenup, now is the time.
How can same-sex couples who are in the position where they're using a donor sperm contract to this? Do they contract to this amongst themselves in their prenup? Do they contract it separately?
Contract for what? If they're working with the sperm donor, they should absolutely have a separate contract with their sperm donor, right? But what does that contract say? Is the donation of sperm to them jointly? If so, and they make jointly owned embryos, they need to contract for the disposition of those embryos amongst each other.
Does one party need to adopt the child that is not?
I talk about this all the time. This is like such a common misconception throughout the country. The non-gestating, non-genetic parent has to secure their legal relationship to their child in some capacity. That is especially true when we're talking about LGBTQ couples, especially now when we just saw the Supreme Court last session say, we are coming for gay marriage next, right?
Wow.
If you are basing your legal relationship to your child on the fact that you're married to that child's birth parent, that's a problem. Because if that goes away, this is ripe for someone stripping your parental rights. And it happened in 2023. Courts in Oklahoma and Pennsylvania both took the non-gestating, non-genetic parent off of the child's birth certificate and said you have no parental rights. Both lesbian couples in both situations, and the non-gestating, non-genetic parent lost their child.
That is so sad.
So anything, and I can't even explain. Just like status of embryos is different, the path to securing legal parentage to your child is different in every state. Do whatever's available to you if there's anything available to you. So, New England has a lot of opportunity for same-sex couples. It's very different in other states. So call a lawyer in your state that's familiar with assisted reproduction and secure your legal relationship to your child.
It's amazing advice, and we are adding information every single day to HelloPrenup to allow anyone even those who may never use our service, access to that information. Because sometimes I think that, we heavily rely on just Google it and see what comes up. And it's hard to know what's reliable. It's hard to know what's real. And it's hard for many people to get access to an attorney who's an expert in this area like yourself.
It is also always changing. So assisted reproduction, I've said this to other attorneys that are like, this is so cool, I want to do this.
Yeah.
This is not like a dip your toe in situation.
Yeah.
This is an all-in situation. It's always changing. You have to be invested in keeping up with those changes.
Yeah.
You have to be invested in what's going on with reproductive medicine because these all impact. You can't practice this area of law in a vacuum, right? You need to know what's going on legislatively, both federally and at your state level, and get involved at your state level, change the law. Maine last year, I have to give credit to the attorneys at GLAAD, passed legislation in Maine making it easy and affordable for the non-gestating, non-genetic parent to adopt their child through assisted reproduction. So this was such a win, and they deserve so much credit. And that was one state. They try to do that everywhere. I'm just so impressed by them. So
what happens if you never include an embryo clause in your prenup and you don't have a disposition agreement and you just can't remember what you put in those clinic forms?
So that's the perfect storm of a nightmare situation, right? Let's say we're going to take a cis hetero couple as our example, right? Let's say they never get around to addressing who owns the embryos. They go through IVF. Maybe they don't even fill out the clinic forms, or maybe they fill them out and they didn't answer that part. Or maybe they fill them out and they change their mind, right? Yeah. Now they're divorcing. Maybe they have children, maybe they don't, but there's a number of remaining embryos. And what happens? Okay, you're going to fight about them in court. The court, it's going to cost money, first of all. As we talked about before, heartache. Whether or not you get the outcome you want in the interim, a lot of heartache and a lot of stress. Yep. And ultimately, the court is either going to enforce your clinic forms as you completed them, right? On, you know how everyone completes forms, right? Like 5 minutes right before you go in for the procedure. At that point, you're hoping for any embryos. You're not thinking about having extra embryos. Right. You're not in the right mindset. So they're either going to enforce those clinic forms, and maybe you still want that, maybe you don't, or they're going to say, forget about these clinic forms. We're going to balance the right to procreate against the right to not procreate. And we've seen where courts land on that. And typically in this hypothetical of a cis hetero couple,
how that goes.
The woman is not walking out of that with what she wants.
What do you do in the instance where a couple has a prenup, but they didn't include anything about embryo disposition in the prenup? How should they contract this?
So I've done a number of these in both Maine and New York, where I practice. New York has a very clear statute, so there's a little more guidance. And the reason why I think New York has a clear statute is because there was so much litigation in New York over couples divorcing and fighting over embryos, right? We've seen less of that in Maine, but we've seen some. So I would love to push for a statute in Maine. If your state has a statute, great. And if it doesn't, that's okay. Address it in writing in a way that can be legally enforceable, so you have the ability to have something that shows intent and consent.
Tell me what you like about prenups.
I like that it forces couples to have these conversations, right? People from religious backgrounds have pre-Cana, and they have other forms of counseling, right, leading up to their wedding. This is like the modern day counseling, right? You're having these tough conversations, but they're before things get bad. And it's not only what if this doesn't work, right? You're also talking about, well, what do you expect from this marriage? What if this does work? What if we're together for the rest of our lives? Let's have these conversations now. Yeah. I didn't realize that you expected to stay at home with the children forever. Let's talk about what that looks like, right? Yeah. So I think having these conversations, and it always comes up in the context of a prenup where someone in my review with my client says, I didn't even think about that. Yeah. We didn't even talk about that. Yeah. Oh, I don't know what they feel. Yeah. So it forces you to have these conversations early on. And yeah, it's uncomfortable, but you get to a really good place. I love working with HelloPrenup because the couples have already kind of filled out those forms, and they've had that like back and forth already. So when I meet with them, they're very confident in their answers. They've had the ability to sleep on it and think about it and give it due weight. So I just really encourage everyone to get a prenup. It's not only disaster planning, it's also planning for it to work, for your marriage to work.
A prenup is about having transparent conversations, and I avoid talking about divorce intentionally because I don't think the main purpose of a prenup should be disaster planning, right? You're not divorce planning by getting a prenup. If that were the case, I don't think they'd be enforceable, right? What you're doing is you're planning for a happy, successful marriage, but you want to delineate what property is whose and what happens in the event of divorce or death. Because ultimately, if you don't contract through a prenup, you still have a prenup. The state's just going to decide for you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Half of the prenup conversations are about managing expectations for the duration of the marriage, right? It's not only when this kicks in, when it's over. We've had these important conversations now about our marriage, about our life together.
Yeah.
So those transparent conversations enable you to move forward with that open and transparent feeling with your partner.
So tell me about your experience working with HelloPrenup.
So I've loved working with HelloPrenup so far. I get a draft that I know my client and her or his partner have reviewed and agreed upon certain items in the draft that I receive. I spend a lot of time actually advising the client, and I know that I can make whatever edits that I desire to the draft in the discussions with my client.
And what is it like for you working directly with the client?
The clients come to me informed about what they want, right? Because they've already completed a lot of questions. So a lot of my intake is gone, but what's not changed is my representation of my client.
How do you feel that the HelloPrenup process has made your representation of your client more efficient?
I spend very little time gathering information through intake forms and reviewing, and I spend much more time advising. And that's because by the time my client and I meet, we have a draft to work with, and I explain the ramifications of everything that they've already discussed and agreed to. And it makes our discussion very targeted, and we have communication that's valuable to the client.
Do you feel that the HelloPrenup process has made your communication with the client more efficient?
I love that I can send my client notes and see that they receive them through the platform. And if I have something specific that I want to highlight before we meet, I will always highlight it in the draft on the HelloPrenup platform. And then when we meet to discuss the contract, I'm able to jump quickly to sections that I know that I want to speak about.
What is your experience with the e-sign and e-notarization?
The e-notarization has made my life so easy because during COVID especially, everyone got very proficient in learning where they could do remote notarizations. So that part has been significantly simplified for me.
How has the e-sign and e-notarization through HelloPrenup made the finalization of the prenup easier?
Everyone is so much more speedy to finalize because all of the steps are taken out of the process, right? You don't have to secure a notary. You don't have to book a time. It's all done for you on the platform.
What would you want to tell attorneys who are considering joining the HelloPrenup network?
You retain all ownership of your work product. So you are able to advise your client on their draft, and you are able to make whatever changes you desire. So know that you're not working with someone else's work product, and you're not working with a template.
What is the average amount of time it takes you to complete a HelloPrenup agreement?
Some clients need a lot more hand-holding, and that's okay, because my time is focused on doing that as opposed to, asking them to fill out a financial disclosure because that's information I already have.
Can attorneys change things on the editor if they want to, or
absolutely.
are they restricted?
Absolutely. Attorneys can change anything, any language that they don't agree with or would like to word differently. You're free to make whatever amendments to the draft that you would like.
What are HelloPrenup clients like?
They come to me very informed and prepared to answer questions because they've already answered questions. So by the time we meet, they have questions specific that they want to ask me, and that guides our discussion. It's a lot less fact-finding.
How do you think the HelloPrenup process facilitates communication between the fiancés?
HelloPrenup's doing a great job of facilitating all of the important topics of conversation that couples should have when entering a prenup.
Janine, this has been great. Do you have any closing thoughts for us?
Closing thoughts. Get involved in your state legislatively. Go do something. Organize something. Make your state a little bit better. If we continue to see the trend from the Supreme Court of returning rights to the states, your participation matters greatly.
How can people do that?
You can join a nonprofit, join forces with a nonprofit. You don't have to join the nonprofit. You can join forces with a nonprofit. You can organize grassroots support of a bill that you're passionate about. You can work to write a bill that you're passionate about. But if you make your state a little better for the families in it, it is going to have incredible consequences. And I just am so inspired by my clients, and I always encourage people to do that. So,
where can couples find you?
You can find me at www.mainreproductionlawyer.com or www.nyreproductionlawyer.com. And I am so grateful that you had me today.
Thank you so much for being here. This was so much fun.
Thank you.